Hello, I'm Deb Cheslow, and in this four-part series, I'll be sharing information related to the awareness and prevention of domestic violence and violence against women. Did you know that 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence? More disturbing is that 1 in 4 homicides in this district alone are domestic violence related. Joining me to discuss this issue are Angie Pye and Michelle Simonson. With 20 years in domestic violence service, Angie has worked with a focus on community coordination in rural areas. She currently holds the title of CEO for the Domestic Abuse Council in Daytona Beach. Michelle Simonson has served as an assistant state attorney since 1998 and is responsible for making filing decisions in felony domestic violence criminal cases. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Angie, it sounds like you've had quite the whirlwind of experience out there. Tell us a little bit about how you got started and what brought you to being the CEO of the Domestic Abuse Council.
Well, initially I was working with law enforcement agencies and started coming in contact with domestic and sexual violence victims, and I tended to gravitate more towards the advocacy side of trying to provide support and safety for the mainly women that I had contact with. And as a survivor myself, I think it was a good fit, and I've always just sort of fell into it and stayed there.
Wonderful. And Michelle, assistant state attorney, how does one get to that point in a career?
Well, I've actually been on both sides of the fence. I started out as a prosecutor in South Carolina way back in 1991, and then I switched sides and became an assistant federal public defender for about 5 years, and then ended up moving down here to Volusia County and got a job with the state attorney's office. I started out in sexual violence cases, took a little bit of time off to have a child, and came back, and I've been handling domestic violence cases ever since.
Okay, wonderful. So, Angie, let's start with you. What is domestic violence? That can be a very broad term. How would you define it?
It can. I would define it by patterns of behavior when one individual is using physical violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, or other kind of control tactics over another individual in an intimate relationship with the intent to control that victim.
So an intent to control, I think part of the problem is in society we have conventional wisdom that we're dealing with and preconceived notions of what's acceptable and what's not. How would you describe the difference between a healthy relationship and one that's not so healthy?
Well, I tell a lot of the women that I work with that, you know, if they're uncomfortable in this situation, if they're living in a relationship where they feel like they have to base all their decisions on how their partner will respond, then that may be something that's just not healthy that they want to maybe explore and think about. Because a healthy relationship should have some equality to it, and you shouldn't be fearful to talk to your partner about anything that you face and be able to have that support from your partner. So when you don't have that, the relationship may be moving towards being unhealthy. So there'd be things that you would want to look at and explore about your relationship.
Well, what do you consider some warning signs, some telltale, oh, wait a minute, maybe this isn't quite right?
Abusive relationships start out as normal as non-abusive relationships, and there's no, the real huge indicator in the beginning, but some of the things that we encourage women to think about is if you're with a partner that needs to know where you are all the time, that wants an update on where you are, what you're doing, who you're with, gets upset if they can't reach you for a certain period of time. Those are some of the things that we see kind of early in the relationship. It's not, there's some jealousy that people think is okay, and jealousy is a natural emotion, but when that jealousy erupts into putting you in a situation that you're uncomfortable in the relationship, or that you're being questioned or accused of things that you didn't do, that would be some red flags. And those things in the beginning to people don't seem in and of themselves abusive, and they may not necessarily escalate to the point of physical violence or threat, But those are definitely things that I would give pause to in the relationship and work on how that individual's responding and whether or not I'm comfortable with that, and maybe try to communicate about that early. And if that person's not willing to listen, that would be a red flag.
So do you find that it's a difficult line to recognize where in the beginning, if someone doesn't contact you enough or ask what you're doing enough, you think they don't love you or they don't care, but then too much becomes too much? How do you start to recognize that line?
It's very difficult to recognize. And I think that's for what happens for a lot of people is when you're early in a relationship, you want to talk to the person a lot, you want to have a lot of conversation, they're texting, they're calling. And then as relationships start to settle and become more comfortable, you don't necessarily need that constant contact, but when one individual requires it or it gets more even aggressive, they couldn't reach you for a certain period of time, and maybe your phone goes dead, but then whenever you have contact with them, they're angry or they're making accusations. That's when it kind of crosses the line. I mean, there's a mutual respect in relationships that is important, and it's so when you're in a long-term relationship, you certainly want to share with your partner if you're going to be late or whatever. You don't want your partner to worry, but the reaction to that is kind of what we're looking for. If the reaction to me being late is that I get accused of having affairs or doing things that I shouldn't do,
Right.
that's when I want to kind of back up and say, is this relationship maybe not going the way it should?
With a lot of the victims that I come in contact with, the domestic violence doesn't occur right away. It manifests itself over time in a lot of different fashions. It might be economic control and limiting access to money or not allowing someone to have the use of an ATM card. It might be making threats about a pet. If you don't do something, I'm going to injure the pets or the children. It's very subtle in a lot of ways, and many victims don't even realize that it's happening until the abusive behavior, the physical violence actually occurs.
I think that's a wonderful point that we should probably go a little bit deeper on. We've all gotten so caught up in Hollywood and the movies, and I think a lot of people, when we say domestic violence, it's about being hit or being killed or guns or knives. But there's a lot more subtle forms, are there not? What is domestic violence?
I think similarly to what Michelle is saying, I've worked with a lot of women in groups who will say things like, that's just how men are, that's just how they behave. And, you have to say that's not. It's what we've been taught through, maybe our homes or through media, just on social media, all the things that you see. And I think that a lot of women sometimes think that that's just acceptable behavior, and it's really not acceptable behavior. And it's not uncommon to get married, for instance, and to put things in a partner's name, and that happens for a lot of victims. That's just sort of those early tactics. Is I have women call and say, I want to leave, and I'll say, do you have a vehicle? And they'll say, well, I do, but it's in his name, and he's told me that if I take it, he'll report it stolen. Not realizing that if you're married, it's yours too, but if you're not, then you have those challenges. So perpetrators will set it up that way to where they're the one that has the power if she tries to make these decisions or go get money, maybe not have access to the bank, maybe not have access to credit cards. And those subtle forms are a lot more challenging to ask for help about, or to, because you think that, well, we're married and it's kind of okay, and it's, or we've been in this long-term relationship where we have kids in common, and so these things are to be expected. And really what they're doing is putting the victim in a position to be more isolated and have less support.
But of course, that doesn't mean that if everything is in your husband's name for good reasons, that it's bad. I mean,
Exactly.
it's a matter of whether you're consenting or not, correct?
That's really the challenge, because it comes down to, I use an example a lot that, I don't, take trash out at my house a lot. My husband gets, he comes home after a couple of days, he's like, really? But we have certain roles in our home that it's okay if this is his role and this is my role, but the consequence to not fulfilling that role is where we come into question.
That
if,
makes sense.
if I didn't take the trash out and he was gone for a couple days and he came home and he berates me or harms me, that's not
That's the problem.
acceptable. So that's where, it's okay to have those sort of gender roles in the home if everybody's okay with it, if everybody's comfortable and there's no
Right.
consequence. So that's where the troubles are. come in.
So we have the physical level and we have a control level of abuse.
Right.
Let's talk to the emotional side for a minute, because I think that's a very strong one out there, that most people don't realize that it's not okay to have someone make you feel that way on a regular
Right.
basis. Can you elaborate on that?
I can. It's interesting when I ask women, over 20 years, I've asked women, what's the worst thing that your partner ever did to you? And while I've seen women thrown from cars and burned with cigarettes and broken bones, a lot of times they'll talk about that emotional abuse, that, telling them that they're unattractive, ugly, they are terrible parents or mothers, they're terrible cooks. That constant daily berating of them takes such a toll on them emotionally, and that's so damaging, and it's very traumatic, and it's a lot to recover from.
We talk about that a lot. There's a lot of victims who justify the behavior of the abuser as something that they did. They said something or they did something to cause that behavior to occur to them, and that they are responsible for the abuser's behavior, not the abuser.
So it's my fault that I shouldn't have made him feel that way, and then he
Absolutely.
wouldn't have lashed out.
They have been beaten down, they've been called names, and on a daily basis, they begin to believe what they've been told.
Right. And unfortunately, when women tell their family members or friends that something happens, sometimes what they get asked is, what did you do? And that reinforces that I did something wrong to deserve this. And,
Right.
it presents that challenge for them.
So let's go a little deeper on tactics, things that the average person might not recognize is an abuse situation. What kind of tactics do these abusers use that are more on the subtle side?
I think sometimes going with them everywhere, not letting them go somewhere alone. I think a lot of friends see that. He drops you off, he picks you up, he calls you while you're here. I've worked with people that were victims of domestic violence that as soon as they got to work, they had to call their partner, or as soon as they left, they had to call. If they went out on break, they had to call them. Those are the things that I think we see sometimes that kind of are like, well, that's a little strange, but we don't know how to address it maybe. But those are some signs that it could be occurring, that may be happening.
And early on tactics, little things seem to add up, right? I mean, does it
Absolutely.
turn into full-blown control? How's that
Absolutely.
transition occur?
I think it transitions with the reaction of the partner and the fear, and you'll hear them say things, well, he won't want me to do that, or he won't want me to go there, or he doesn't really like for me to talk to that person, or going through their Facebook pages or their phones, they'll make comments, to their friends about these things happening. And I think sometimes they may say it to see if other people are experiencing that. And but those early things, they're like Michelle said, they're just very subtle, and we don't see them as outward abuse. You can't call the cops if your boyfriend or husband or partner is going through your Facebook page. I mean, it's
Right.
not a crime. So that sort of reinforces that in some ways it's okay, because nobody's saying that it's not. And women have a tendency to dismiss how they're feeling about it, thinking that they're being irrational. And I mean, society kind of says to women sometimes that we're irrational. It's a message that we get.
Right.
So then we think, well, maybe I shouldn't think about it that way. Maybe I'm overreacting to it. And I'm sure Michelle's heard that too, that it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. And again, if I hadn't have done this, that wouldn't have happened. So it's re-educating people, and we have to work on certainly re-educating the community about what all that looks like.
Absolutely. Because I think it's obvious that we have a domestic violence, a domestic abuse issue in our society today, and it's on the news, and of course it's in the movies and all over Hollywood. But based on what you're saying, it sounds to me like the even bigger problem is the level of silence. Is there a lot more abuse
Absolutely.
out there that we don't even know about, or that perhaps makes it to the courtroom and then you can't do anything with it because they rescind?
certainly a big issue that we have, and it affects all ages, all classifications. I've had individuals who have a lot of money as a partnership, but one partner controls all the rest of it, and the other partner may not even have an ATM card or have any access to it. There's usually a variety of ways in which that power and control is exercised, and many times they just don't even realize it. We have abusers who bring the victims to our office and sit outside and wait for them, and where's that paper that you're going to fill out to get those charges dropped?
Wow.
So it continues, never goes away.
So let's cut right to the chase here. The question I hear the most often, and I think is in most people's minds, if you're being abused, if you don't like the way you feel, if someone's hitting you, if they're not being good to your children or your pets, they're controlling your life, why wouldn't you just leave?
Yeah, it seems simple.
It
Seems like it
does.
would be. And what we do know is that women's chances of being murdered by their partner increase by about 75% when they leave the relationship. That loss of control can set the perpetrator off. So women leave safely every day, and there's ways to leave safely. That's why we want to support them in doing that. But it's, I say all the time, I wouldn't have a shelter available if perpetrators of this crime just left their victims alone, if they just let them leave. And
That's
they
true.
don't just let them leave. They stalk them, they harass them, they threaten them. They live under that threat all the time. If they have kids in common, they still have to deal with them for the rest of their life. He's still the
True.
dad. He's still going to see the kids. So those are things that she has to think about when she thinks about leaving and how she's going to handle that, because I'm going to have to see him again. I'm going to have to interact with him again. So how am I going to do that safely?
Yeah, leaving safely is a process. It's not just something that you do overnight. It's actually something you have to plan and prepare for. And the Domestic Abuse Council is very good at helping victims and survivors come up with safety plans and things that they can do to keep themselves safe. But it is a process, and the most dangerous time for her or him is when they decide to leave.
Absolutely.
So the friends, the family, it sounds like they could be on either side here. Let's talk first about when friends and family are the ones seeing it and they're saying, you need to leave, you need to leave, you need to leave, but don't understand the safety side.
Right.
How do we handle that?
I think it's sad for families, because when you have somebody in your family that's suffering from, whether it's domestic violence or other issues, it's challenging to see somebody that you love in that situation. And interestingly, it's not uncommon for women to make those attempts to leave and then end up going back into the relationship. And, people who ultimately end up divorced where there's no abuse really try to work their relationship out first. This is no different. People
Right.
want to try to work their relationships out. So when they go back, sometimes the family feels, frustrated and can kind of throw their hands up. And we always say that's the worst thing to do, because it reinforces the perpetrator's isolation of the victim. As hard as it is, we have to keep our door open and just let that individual work through that process of leaving and leaving safely, and try to support her decision. She's the expert in his behavior. She knows how he's going to react to everything. So from a domestic violence center perspective, that's the conversation that we're having a lot. And women know if they choose to go back to try to they want to work on the relationship, that they always have the option to come back into shelter and that they'll not be turned away. They need to know that there's somebody, and family and friends should certainly be the first, person to go to, but they need somebody that they can go to no matter what, and know that they're going to be supported and that they're going to have somebody that's going to help them with their safety.
Right. So is that what tends to happen, that it's a process that repeats itself before it's ultimately resolved?
It usually is about 5 to 7 times of separation before the relationship is ultimately ended completely. And there's so many things that lead to that decision making for the victim. And again, it comes back to the fact that they have a relationship and she does care about him.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's easy for us to sit on the outside and think, oh, he's a terrible person, he's not always terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And he does do nice things, and he is good to her at times. And so that's something that she has to work through individually and decide for herself what's healthy for her and what she what's safe for her. And, you know, it's easy for us to say to walk away because we don't care about the person. They do.
Well, and I think we need to go back to that statistic for a moment that you said. That was mind-blowing, that 75%.
Yeah, 75% are, it's 75% increase of being murdered, chances of being murdered when they leave the relationship. And that's the first thing anybody wants them to do. You know, we want them to call the police, we want them to leave, we want them to get a restraining order. And those are all things that are very dangerous too for the victim. So they do need to be explored by somebody that has, you know, maybe a professional or somebody that has experience in the field that can really sort out.
So we want to emphasize that there are safe ways.
Absolutely.
But we just don't want to haphazardly go at this, why don't you just leave?
Exactly, exactly. Women leave safe every day.
Okay.
So I've worked with thousands of women who left safely. You know, sadly, I've worked with women who were killed, and they were making efforts to leave. And so that, knowing that they're making efforts to leave, knowing they're even thinking about it, knowing they're even talking about it with a friend, safety planning needs to start right then.
So is there a legal process, first several steps we can discuss as to how to get that safe process going?
Well, there are options, legal options out, like injunctions for protection against domestic violence. I think the first step really is for them to reach out to a professional, a counselor, somebody that they trust, and talk about what would happen when they leave. What do they think would happen? How would he react? We ask a lot, have you ever left before, and what was the response of your partner? Because that's probably going to be the response again. You know, how long were you gone? If you're gone 4 to 6 weeks and you went back, then everything that perpetrator did over the 4 to 6 week period to coerce you home, he's going to do again. So we can start talking about that and putting things in place to help support her through that and help her think about next steps that would be safe for her. And then certainly there's the legal option of an injunction that would require the perpetrator not to have any contact with the victim. But there's still, he doesn't mean he's going to abide by that judge's order either. So you still need the safety planning in place and the resources available to contact.
So before, I want to go a little bit further on what happens on that legal side. But before we do that, let's make sure we cover the other side of the coin with the family. We have the family that's saying, why don't you just leave? But
Right.
are there not a fair number of family members where they're part of the problem? Because they're saying, what have you done?
Right.
How does that change things?
It can change things a lot because the women could be told, or the victims could be being told, you know, you're married now, you have kids in common. You know, what
Exactly.
about their dad? They need to have a dad in their life, you know. That puts pressure on the victim to sort of suck up what's happening to them and try to endure it for the benefit of everybody else. And it's really not fair to her. And it's not healthy for kids to grow up in a home with a father that beats their mother. I mean, it's just not. So there's resources that, you know, could help that individual, and if families can get engaged to try to even safely confront the perpetrator into dealing with his behavior. I mean, those things can be good options for them, but unfortunately people don't know what to do. And so they
Right.
do say those things, you know, to victims and put them in a place of thinking that they're doing something wrong.
So if I'm now watching the show and going, maybe that's me. Maybe I do have a problem, but I don't know, and I'm afraid, and I'm not sure what to do. What would be the first step?
To reach out to a certified domestic violence center in their area, and they can talk confidentially, and they can be anonymous, and they can talk to somebody about what's happening in their relationship, how they feel about it, and come to the conclusions that are right for them.
Conclusions that are right for them, I think that's the key. Now what happens, let's try to eliminate some of the fear right now. What happens next with the person that says, that is me, I really do have a problem, I need to find a safe way to get out for me, for the kids? Then what does happen on the legal side?
Well, I think Angie's advice is perfect, to reach out to the shelter first, and then if it becomes to the point that there's a criminal allegation involved, a person can go to the law enforcement agency to make a report of what the conduct is. They can also seek an injunction for protection. There are injunctions against domestic violence through the family court, a number of options, and they can also talk to legal services about whether a divorce is appropriate, whether child custody issues need to be dealt with, a lot of avenues. But I think the first step is reaching out to the shelter and then the law enforcement agency that has jurisdiction over where the offense would have occurred.
Okay, so all these services that you're mentioning, both of you, are they free, or how does that work?
Center services are free. Domestic violence center services are free services. That they can get shelter for free and counseling for free, support groups that they can participate in with other women, which is very validating. That's a good place to start, I think, for women, even if they're in the relationship and they're just not sure whether their relationship is abusive or not abusive. Sometimes being in a support group with peers can help them identify what's uncomfortable in their relationship.
And there's no cost to talk to a law
Yeah.
enforcement officer, and there's no cost to file for an injunction.
Right.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for being with us and sharing such valuable information. If you or someone you know is involved in an abusive relationship or living in an environment of abuse, there is help. So stay with us for information on where to go for assistance. And again, many thanks to the Department of Justice and the Office on Violence Against Women for making this program possible.